Neon buzzed like a dying wasp above the liquor shelf, casting a sickly green pallor over the sticky tables. Nora didn't want to be here. Her boots clung to the floor, coated in a decade of spilled beer and terrible decisions. Then came the dare. A stupid, drunken challenge pointed straight at the man in the back booth. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't talking. He was perfectly, terrifyingly still. One kiss. She thought it was just a joke. She was terribly wrong. Bass thumped through the floorboards of O'Malley's, vibrating up through the soles of Nora's worn combat boots. It was a rhythmic, oppressive sensation that did nothing to drown out the screech of Chloe's laughter. I'm telling you, he's basically a statue. Chloe slammed her empty shot glass onto the scratched veneer of their table. The glass was cloudy. Everything in this bar felt coated in a thin layer of grime, a film you could never quite wash off, no matter how hot the water got back home. Nora stared at the crumpled $50 bill Chloe had slapped down next to the glass. $50. To Chloe, it was an afterthought, the remnants of a generous tip from her bartending shift across town. To Nora, it was the exact amount needed to stop her gas from being shut off on Tuesday. The temperature in her apartment had been hovering around 50 degrees for 3 days. She was tired of sleeping in her winter coat. Look at him, Chloe urged, her words slurring slightly at the edges, heavy with the scent of cheap tequila and synthetic lime. He's been sitting there for an hour. Hasn't touched that scotch. Hasn't looked at his phone. He looks like an undertaker. Nora followed Chloe's gaze through the dim, smoke-hazed room. The corner booth was engulfed in shadows, far from the sickly neon glow of the bar. He sat with his back against the faux leather padding. He wore a dark wool overcoat, unbuttoned over a charcoal suit. In a dive bar populated by college dropouts and exhausted factory workers, he stuck out like a jagged piece of glass. He wasn't conventionally handsome in the way billboards sold it. His face was sharp, carved by exhaustion, with hollows beneath his cheekbones and a jawline set so tight it looked painful. He was staring at the table in front of him, unblinking, serene, or maybe just dead inside. I'm not going over there, Nora said. Her voice sounded thin, lacking conviction. She couldn't stop looking at the crumpled bill. Washington's green face mocked her. You're a coward, Chloe sing-songed, leaning heavily against the back of her chair. It's easy. Walk up. Say you lost a bet. Plant one on him. Walk away $50 richer. He's probably some corporate drone whose wife just left him. He could use the thrill. Nora rubbed the bridge of her nose. The air smelled of stale grease and pine cleaner. She hated this. She hated the desperation tightening her chest, the raw, ugly pragmatism that made her weigh her own dignity against a utility bill. Just the cheek, Nora bargained, her eyes dropping to the money. On the mouth, Chloe countered, slamming a hand on the table. Or no deal. Nora swallowed. Her mouth was dry. She stood up before she could talk herself out of it, snatching the 50 and shoving it deep into the front pocket of her jeans. The fabric felt rough against her clammy knuckles. Watch me. The walk across the room felt agonizingly slow. The bass from the jukebox seemed to sync with her erratic pulse. Her boots scuffed against the floorboards. Someone bumped her shoulder, a frat boy smelling of cheap body spray, but she barely registered the impact. Her focus narrowed entirely to the man in the booth. As she drew closer, the details sharpened. He was older than she had first guessed. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. There was a faint silver scar cutting through the dark stubble on his left jaw. His tie was perfectly knotted. He didn't look like a man whose wife had left him. He looked like a man who arranged funerals. She stopped beside his table. The air around him felt 10 degrees colder. He didn't look up. Nora opened her mouth, but the rehearsed excuse, "I lost a bet, I'm sorry," evaporated. Panic seized her throat. She was a trespasser in his orbit. The instinct to turn and run was primal, screaming in her ears. But the cold weight of her apartment waited for her. She leaned down. The movement was clumsy. She braced her hand on the edge of his table, her fingers brushing the condensation on his untouched glass of scotch. Finally he moved. His head turned, slow and deliberate. His eyes caught hers. They were pale, a startling washed-out gray, flat and devoid of any readable human emotion. There was no surprise, no curiosity, just a vast, terrifying emptiness. It was too late to stop her momentum. Nora closed her eyes, entirely missing her mark as he turned, and her lips crashed clumsily against the corner of his mouth. It wasn't soft. It wasn't romantic. It was like pressing her face against a stone wall. His skin was cold. He smelled sharply of ozone, peppermint, and a faint metallic tang that her brain vaguely registered as copper. Before she could pull away, before she could even register the awkwardness of the contact, a large, heavy hand clamped around her wrist. Her eyes snapped open. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't leaned back. His grip on her wrist was a vice of bone and sinew, arresting her movement entirely. The pressure was exact, professional. He was calculating how easily he could snap the joint. "What?" he asked, his voice barely a rasp, low and grating like gravel under a tire. "Do you think you are doing—" Nora tried to yank her arm back, a knee-jerk reaction of pure flight. The man's grip didn't budge a millimeter. The friction of his calloused thumb against her skin burned. I'm sorry," she stammered. Her voice cracked, a humiliating squeak in the heavy silence that seemed to have suddenly isolated their booth from the rest of the noisy bar. "It was a dare. A stupid dare." His pale gray eyes tracked her face. He was searching for something. Deceit, maybe, or a hidden weapon. The lack of anger was what terrified her most. If he had yelled, if he had called her crazy or shoved her away, she would have understood. People got angry. Anger was normal. This utter stillness was a predator's assessment. "A dare," he repeated. The words lacked any inflection. Before Nora could offer another pathetic apology, the shadows around the booth shifted. From the adjacent table, previously occupied by two men Nora had assumed were sleeping off a bender, movement erupted. In agonizingly synchronized motion, two massive figures stood up. They didn't stumble. They wore dark jackets that bulked unnaturally around their ribs. The ambient noise of the bar suddenly seemed miles away as one of them took a single, heavy step toward Nora, his hand slipping inside his coat. The dull click of a leather holster unfastening was the loudest sound in the world. Nora's stomach plummeted. Bile rose in the back of her throat, burning and sour. The copper smell radiating from the man in the booth finally clicked in her panicked brain. It wasn't just metal. It was dried blood. "Oh, God! Oh, my God!" Her knees turned to water. She wasn't an action hero. She was 24, exhausted, and barely holding her life together. Her breath began to hitch, shallow, ragged gasps pulling the dusty air into her burning lungs. The man holding her wrist raised his free hand, extending a single index finger. The two giants froze instantly. They didn't speak. They simply waited, coiled and tense, their eyes locked on Nora with casual, murderous intent. The man in the booth looked back at Nora. He watched the color drain from her face. He watched the tremor begin in her shoulders, traveling down her arm to where he held her captive. He catalogued her terror with mild clinical interest. "You smell like cheap vanilla and fear," he said quietly. He finally released her wrist. The sudden lack of pressure made her stumble backward, her hips slamming painfully into a neighboring empty chair. "Get out," he instructed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Nora didn't look back at Chloe. She didn't look at the men in the dark jackets. She turned and ran. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the bar, bursting into the frigid night air. The cold hit her flushed face like a slap. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the wet pavement. She kept walking, her pace frantic, checking over her shoulder every 10 seconds. A stray cat knocking over a trash can made her bite down on her tongue so hard she tasted rust. The $50 bill in her pocket felt like a radioactive core, burning through the denim. When she finally reached her apartment building, she fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice on the concrete stoop. Once inside, she threw the deadbolt, locked the chain, and dragged a heavy wooden dining chair beneath the handle. The apartment was freezing. The radiators were silent, holding no warmth. Nora slid down with her back against the peeling paint of the front door, pulling her knees to her chest. She had kissed him, a man who carried the scent of blood, flanked by men who carried guns. In the dark, lonely silence of her kitchen, the absurdity and the horror of what she had done crashed over her. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes until sparks bloomed in her vision. It was just a dare, she told herself, the mantra useless against the violent thumping of her heart. He let me go. He doesn't know who I am. But as she sat shivering on the linoleum floor, staring at the shadows stretching across her cramped living room, she couldn't shake the sensation of his cold skin or the dead gray emptiness of his eyes. He had looked at her not as a woman, but as an anomaly. And men like that didn't leave anomalies unexamined. 3 days passed. The paranoia didn't fade. It mutated. It settled into the back of Nora's neck like a tight, aching muscle. She paid her gas bill. The apartment was warm again, a small victory that felt entirely hollow. Every time a dark sedan drove past her on the street, her breath caught. Every time the heavy wooden door of the diner swung open, she braced herself for the quiet scrape of a gun holster. By Thursday evening, the exhaustion was making her clumsy. "Carmichael, table 4 needs a refill, and if you drop one more plate today, I'm taking it out of your wages," grumbled Hank, the diner's manager, from behind the grease-stained serving window. "Got it," Nora muttered, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. The diner smelled intensely of burnt filter coffee, frying bacon, and lemon-scented industrial bleach. It was a chaotic sensory overload, but usually it was a comforting chaos. Today, it was just grating. She grabbed the glass carafe of coffee, the handle warm and familiar, and turned toward the dining floor. He was sitting in the corner booth. Nora stopped dead. The carafe tipped slightly, a drop of scalding coffee splashing onto her knuckles, but she barely felt the burn. Aidan MacDonald didn't look like he belonged in a vinyl booth held together by duct tape. He wore a heavy black turtleneck beneath a tailored wool coat. The artificial yellow lighting of the diner cast harsh shadows across his sharp features, highlighting the hollows of his cheeks and the silver scar on his jaw. There were no giant men in jackets. He was alone. He wasn't looking at a menu. He was looking at her. Panic, sharp and blinding, spiked in Nora's chest. She looked toward the door, calculating the distance. Could she make it out? Would he shoot her in a crowded diner? The regulars were eating their meatloaf, utterly oblivious to the predator sitting among them. He raised a hand, making a slow, deliberate motion toward the empty bench across from him. An invitation? An order? Nora's feet moved before her brain could form a coherent objection. The instinct to comply with a man like this bypassed logic. She walked slowly, the coffee carafe trembling slightly in her grip. She stopped at his table. "Black," he said. His voice was the same low, gravelly rasp she remembered. She poured the coffee. Her hand shook, the dark liquid splashing dangerously close to the rim of the thick ceramic mug. She set the carafe down on the formica table. She didn't sit. "I don't have anything," Nora said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her teeth. "I don't know anything. I just wanted $50 to pay my heating bill." Aiden took a slow sip of the scalding coffee. He didn't wince. He set the mug down, aligning it perfectly with the edge of a scratch on the table. "Sit down, Nora." Her breath hitched. He knew her name. Of course he knew her name. Slowly, stiffly, she slid into the booth opposite him. The vinyl squeaked under her weight. "How did you find me?" she asked. "It is remarkably easy to find someone who wears an apron with a logo on it, leaves a bar on foot, and lives 3 blocks away," Aiden said smoothly. His gray eyes drifted over her face, analyzing the dark circles under her eyes, the frayed collar of her uniform. "You made a very foolish decision on Monday." "I know," she whispered, her hands knotting together in her lap to hide their shaking. Are you going to kill me?" Aiden stared at her. For a fraction of a second, the corner of his mouth twitched, a micro-expression that might have been amusement, or perhaps annoyance. "If I wanted you dead, Nora, you would not have made it to your front door." He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. The smell of cold wool and faint peppermint washed over her, bearing the scent of diner grease. "You breached my perimeter. You touched me. My men were prepared to dismantle you." "I'm sorry," she said, hating how small she sounded. "I'm just an idiot." "You are an anomaly," Aiden corrected softly. "People do not approach me. They do not look me in the eye. They certainly do not place their mouths on mine for $50. He reached into his coat pocket. Nora flinched violently, pressing her back against the booth, bracing for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a thick, folded stack of bills. He placed it on the table and slid it across the formica until it touched her trembling hand. It was easily $1,000. "What is this?" she breathed, staring at the money like it was venomous. "You are reckless. You are desperate. Desperate people are unpredictable, and unpredictable people are dangerous," Aiden stated, his tone deeply pragmatic. "I require my environment to be predictable." "I don't understand. Take the money. Fix your heating. Do not ever approach me again. Do not speak of me, and do not let desperation make you stupid." He stood up. The movement was fluid, graceful for a man so rigidly composed. He looked down at her, his expression entirely unreadable. "Keep your head down," Nora Carmichael." He turned and walked out of the diner. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful, ridiculous sound as he pushed through the glass. Nora sat frozen in the booth. The ambient noise of the diner, clinking silverware, chatter, the sizzle of the grill, rushed back into her ears like a physical weight. She looked down at the stack of bills. It was an out, a clean break, a command to disappear back into her miserable, quiet life. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough texture of the paper money. It smelled like crisp ink and very faintly, like copper. She knew she should take it. She knew she should be grateful to be alive. But as she watched his dark coat disappear down the rain-slick street through the diner window, a strange, terrible realization bloomed in her chest. She wasn't just terrified of him. She was entirely, completely captivated. And a man who needed total predictability had just paid her to stay away, wholly unaware that he had just anchored her to him instead. Morning light filtered through the cracked vinyl blinds, casting thin gray stripes across the kitchen table. Nora sat perfectly still. The stack of bills occupied the center of the chipped formica, bound by a simple, unmarked paper band. $1,000. To anyone else in her building, it was a miracle. To her, it felt like an unexploded nerve gas canister. She picked it up. It possessed a dense, unfamiliar weight. Real wealth didn't feel like the crumpled, damp 5s and 10s she shoved into her apron at the diner. This money was crisp. It smelled faintly of industrial ink and the sharp, minty cedar scent she now permanently associated with Aidan MacDonald. She needed groceries. Her stomach gave a hollow, aching churn to remind her she had skipped dinner. Slowly, her thumb slid a single $100 bill from the center of the stack. It felt like stealing. Worse, it felt like selling a piece of herself she didn't know had a price. 2 hours later, Nora stood in the harsh fluorescent glare of a discount supermarket. The linoleum floors were scuffed black, the air smelling of bruised apples and stale cardboard. She stared at a carton of eggs. Then she looked at the green slip of paper in her hand. A sickening hot wave of shame rushed up her neck. "Unpredictable people are dangerous," he had said. "I require my environment to be predictable." He hadn't given her this money to help her. He had given it to her to neutralize a variable. She was a loose end he was neatly tying off with a tax-free bribe. He wanted her to go back to her cold apartment, eat her cheap eggs, and forget the terrifying magnetic gravity of the man in the corner booth. Nora shoved the bill into her pocket, abandoning the plastic shopping basket in the aisle. She walked out into the biting wind, her jaw set so tightly her molars ached. She wasn't a hero. She was cynical, tired, and acutely aware of how insignificant her life was. But she possessed a stubborn, jagged pride that had survived foster care, 2 evictions, and a string of dead-end jobs. Being dismissed, being purchased, ignited a slow-burning fury in her chest. She spent the rest of her shift at the diner in a haze. Hank barked orders, plates clattered. The scent of burning grease coated her skin. But Nora operated on autopilot. Her mind churned, piecing together the few breadcrumbs she had. Chloe came in for a late-night coffee just before closing. Nora cornered her by the pie display. "The guy from O'Malley's," Nora said, keeping her voice low. The diner was nearly empty, just the hum of the refrigerators filling the silence. "The one you dared me to kiss." Chloe blinked, her eyes bloodshot from a double shift. "Are you still hung up on that? You got your $50. Let it go." "Who is he, Chloe?" "He didn't look like a local." Chloe sighed, leaning against the glass counter. "I asked around after you bolted. A couple of the bouncers recognized him. They wouldn't give a name, just said he's a ghost. A guy who handles things for the families operating out of the harbor. They said if you see him sitting quietly, it means someone in the building is having their final drink." Nora's stomach plummeted, a cold knot tightening beneath her ribs. The families. Organized crime wasn't something you interacted with. It was a vague atmospheric pressure in the city. You knew they owned the docks. You knew they skimmed off the construction contracts, but you didn't bump into them at a dive bar. "They say he operates out of the Marrow," Chloe added, stifling a yawn. "That ridiculous private steakhouse downtown. But seriously, Nora, forget it. The guy is a walking graveyard." Nora didn't reply. She wiped down the counter with a bleach-soaked rag, the chemical burn stinging her cracked knuckles. She thought about the stack of bills sitting on her table. She thought about his dead, gray eyes. She went home. She didn't turn on the heat, despite the chill creeping through the window frames. She picked up the stack of money, walked into her tiny bedroom, and pulled a worn leather jacket from the closet. She was going to do something incredibly stupid. But for the first time in years, the numbness of her daily routine was gone, replaced by a terrifying electric current. Thick, heavy mahogany doors stood between Nora and the street. The brass handles were polished to a mirror shine. The Marrow didn't have a neon sign. It barely had a plaque. It was a fortress disguised as a restaurant, catering to men who wore tailored wool and carried silent, devastating power. Nora pushed the door open. The sensory shift was immediate. The air inside was warm, thick with the aroma of charred ribeye, expensive bourbon, and subtle, spicy cigar smoke. The lighting was low and amber, casting long, elegant shadows across the plush red carpets. A maitre d' in a dark suit stepped into her path immediately. His eyes flicked over her scuffed combat boots, her faded denim, and the cheap leather of her jacket. The dismissal in his gaze was absolute. "Miss, I believe you are lost. This is a private establishment," he said, his voice a smooth, impenetrable wall. "I'm looking for Aidan MacDonald," Nora said. Her voice trembled, betraying her bravado. The maître d's expression tightened, a micro shift, but Nora caught it. "There is no one here by that name. I must ask you to leave before I call security." "Tell him Nora is here," she insisted, digging her nails into her palms to stop her hands from shaking. "Tell him the anomaly wants a word." A heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. Nora gasped, spinning around. It wasn't the maître d'. It was one of the giants from O'Malley's. Up close, he was terrifying. His neck was thicker than her thigh, and his eyes were flat, dark, and utterly devoid of mercy. He didn't speak. He simply turned her toward the door, his grip bruising her collarbone. "Let her go, Thomas!" The gravelly rasp cut through the quiet murmur of the restaurant like a serrated blade. The giant released her instantly, stepping back and lowering his head. Nora stumbled, catching her breath as she turned toward the voice. Aidan stood at the entrance of a private alcove. He was out of his overcoat, wearing a charcoal vest over a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle and a tapestry of faded, violent scars. He held a crystal glass containing an amber liquid and a single, heavy cube of ice. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly disappointed. He gave a slight tilt of his head. An order. Nora swallowed the dry lump in her throat and walked toward him, her boots sinking into the thick carpet. He stepped back into the alcove, allowing her to enter. The space was small, paneled in dark wood, dominated by a leather booth and a small circular table. The isolation was oppressive. The sounds of the restaurant faded out, leaving only the clink of the ice in his glass. Aiden set the drink down. He leaned against the edge of the table, crossing his arms. He loomed over her, a dark mass of controlled violence. "I gave you a directive," Aiden said softly. The proximity was suffocating. She could smell the bourbon on his breath, mixed with that underlying scent of peppermint and cold iron. "It was not a complex directive. I don't want your money," Nora said. She reached into her jacket pocket, her fingers brushing the thick envelope. She pulled it out and slammed it onto the small table next to his glass. The thud was loud in the quiet alcove. Auden looked at the envelope, then slowly brought his pale gray eyes back to her face. "You are destitute," he stated, a simple recitation of fact. "Your coat is inadequate for the weather. You wear shoes that offer no arch support. You sell your dignity for $50 to pay for basic utilities. Yet you return $1,000. Why?" It wasn't a question. It was a demand for data. "Because I'm not a problem you can pay to go away," Nora shot back, her voice rising slightly. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She was standing inches from a mafia enforcer, arguing over a bribe. The absurdity fueled her adrenaline. "You don't get to look at me like I'm dirt, hand me cash, and tell me to disappear. I kiss who I want. I take dares because I'm broke. But I don't take hush money from men who smell like corpses." The silence that followed her outburst was absolute. Nora stopped breathing. She waited for him to strike her. She waited for the giant named Thomas to drag her into an alley. Aiden uncrossed his arms. He reached out. Nora flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. A cold, calloused finger brushed against her jawline. The touch was agonizingly light, tracing the curve of her bone up to her earlobe. A violent shiver racked her frame. She opened her eyes. He was staring at her with an intensity that pinned her to the floor. The dead, empty look was gone. In its place was a sharp, clinical fascination. He was studying her like a scientist examining a highly volatile, completely unfamiliar chemical reaction. "You are terrified of me," Aiden murmured, his thumb coming to rest against her erratic pulse point at the base of her throat. He felt the frantic, bird-like flutter of her heart against his skin. "Your pupils are dilated. You are vibrating with fear." "I am," she whispered. She couldn't step back. His touch anchored her, a paralyzing contradiction of threat and intimacy. "And yet you came here. You insulted me in my own territory. You rejected a necessary financial transaction out of pride?" He tilted his head slightly. "It defies logic. I'm human. We don't always use logic." "I do," Aiden replied smoothly. He dropped his hand. The sudden absence of his heat left her skin feeling cold. "Logic dictates that I should have Thomas break your legs and drop you outside the city limits for creating a disturbance." Nora's breath hitched. Aiden picked up his glass. He took a slow drink, the ice clicking sharply against the crystal. "But you are a curiosity, Nora Carmichael. You lack the instinct for self-preservation." He set the glass down, picking up the envelope of money. He held it out to her. "Take it, not as a bribe, but as a retainer." Nora frowned, confusion cutting through her panic. "A retainer for what? I am a man who deals exclusively in predictable outcomes," Aiden said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum. My life is a structured equation. You are chaos. You are entirely dangerously erratic." He stepped closer, closing the final inch between them. His chest brushed the rough leather of her jacket. The heat radiating off him was immense. "I find I am suddenly interested in observing chaos," he whispered, his lips mere inches from her ear. The gravel in his voice sent a shockwave down her spine. "Take the money, Nora. Buy a better coat, and prepare yourself. Because the next time you see me, you will not be allowed to walk away." He stepped back, the mask of cold indifference snapping back into place seamlessly. "Thomas will escort you out." Nora didn't argue. She took the envelope. Her fingers brushed his, the spark of static electricity sharp and biting. She turned and walked out of the alcove, her legs shaking so badly she barely felt the thick carpet beneath her boots. As the cold night air hit her face outside the marrow, Nora realized the devastating truth. She hadn't gone there to give the money back. She had gone there to make sure he saw her again. And she had just handed a predator the keys to her fractured, chaotic life. 17 days passed without a single shadow shifting out of place. Nora bought the coat. It was charcoal gray, heavy wool blend from an army surplus store, smelling faintly of mothballs and industrial fabric dye. It hung past her knees and kept the biting December wind from slicing through to her ribs. Every time she buttoned it, she felt a sickening lurch of guilt. She was walking around draped in mafia money. It felt less like armor and more like a tracking collar. Paranoia became her permanent roommate. She stopped sleeping through the night. Every creak of the floorboards in her apartment building sent a jolt of adrenaline straight into her teeth. She found herself scanning the faces of the passengers on the morning bus, looking for cold gray eyes or the bulky silhouette of men carrying concealed weapons. But there was nothing. Aidan MacDonald had promised she wouldn't be allowed to walk away, and then he had simply vanished, leaving her to marinate in her own dread. It was a brilliant, cruel psychological tactic. By the third week, Nora wasn't just afraid, she was angry. The adrenaline had nowhere to go, souring into a bitter, restless exhaustion. Tuesday afternoon brought a bitter frost that cracked the pavement and kept the diner mostly empty. Nora was wiping down the stainless steel counter around the pie display, the smell of burnt sugar and industrial bleach stinging her nostrils. She dragged the rag in slow, hypnotic circles, trying to focus on the grit beneath the cloth rather than the hum her own anxiety. The bell above the door chimed. Nora didn't look up immediately. "Take any booth you like. Coffee's fresh," she called out, her voice scraping the silence. Heavy, measured footsteps crossed the black and white checkered linoleum. They didn't head for a booth. They stopped directly in front of the counter, casting a massive, solid shadow over the display case. Nora stopped wiping. She slowly lifted her head. Thomas stood there. The giant wore the same dark, immaculately tailored jacket that strained against his shoulders. Up close in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the diner, his face looked like a block of granite that had been repeatedly struck with a hammer. His nose was crooked, his brow thick, his eyes dead flat. He didn't look at the menu. He looked at her. "Your shift ended 4 minutes ago," Thomas said. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated against the glass of the pie case. Nora swallowed hard. The damp rag slipped from her fingers, plopping onto the counter with a wet slap. "Hank asked me to stay and clean the fryers." Hank is currently in the back office, experiencing a severe migraine. Thomas replied calmly. "He will not require you to clean the fryers." A cold sweat broke out across the back of Nora's neck. She glanced toward the kitchen swing doors. They were shut tight. The subtle clatter of pots and pans had ceased entirely. Hank wasn't a man who got migraines. He was a man who worked through the flu. "Did you hurt him?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Her fingers curled over the edge of the metal counter, bracing for flight. "I offered him $500 to require a sudden nap," Thomas corrected, showing zero emotion. "He accepted the transaction. Get your coat, Miss Carmichael." "And if I refuse?" Thomas simply blinked. He didn't posture. He didn't reach inside his jacket. He didn't need to. The absolute certainty in his posture answered the question. She could walk out the door under her own power, or she could be carried out unconscious. The destination would be identical. Nora untied her apron with shaking hands, tossing it into the laundry bin beneath the register. She grabbed the heavy charcoal coat from the staff rack. It felt 10 times heavier as she slipped it over her shoulders. She walked around the counter. Thomas stepped back, offering her a wide berth, a terrifying display of polite captivity. Stepping outside, the freezing air slapped her cheeks. Parked directly in front of the diner, ignoring the rusted fire hydrant, was a sleek black sedan. The windows were tinted so dark they looked like polished obsidian. Thomas opened the rear door. He waited. Nora hesitated on the curb. This was the threshold. Getting into that car meant actively stepping over the line that separated her miserable, safe world from the violent undercurrents of the city. She climbed in. The interior smelled of expensive leather, ozone, and a faint lingering trace of peppermint. The door shut behind her with a heavy vacuum-sealed thud, cutting off the sounds of the street entirely. The silence was immediate and oppressive. She was alone in the back seat. The privacy glass separating her from the driver was raised. The engine was already running, a barely perceptible vibration beneath her boots. As the car pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly through the icy streets, Nora realized her hands were clutched so tightly in her lap, her knuckles ached. She forced her fingers to uncurl, pressing them flat against her thighs. They drove for 20 minutes. The cityscape outside the tinted glass shifted from the cramped, dirty brick of her neighborhood to the sprawling skeletal infrastructure of the industrial harbor. Massive shipping cranes loomed against the darkening sky like iron spiders. The smell of the sea, brine, rotting kelp, and heavy diesel exhaust seeped through the vents. The car navigated a maze of corrugated metal warehouses, finally pulling to a stop inside a cavernous loading bay. The massive rolling door clattered shut behind them, plunging the space into shadow before harsh overhead floodlights snapped on. The rear door opened. Thomas was there. "Up the stairs," he instructed, gesturing toward a set of grated metal steps that clung to the side of a concrete office structure built directly into the warehouse wall. Nora climbed. Her boots clanged loudly against the metal grating. At the top, a solid steel door sat slightly ajar. She pushed it open. Fluorescent tubes buzzed erratically on the ceiling of the office, casting a stark, unforgiving white light over bare concrete walls. The room was freezing, smelling sharply of black coffee, machine oil, and stale cigarette smoke. There were no plush carpets here, no mahogany tables, just filing cabinets, a massive corkboard plastered with shipping manifests, and a battered metal desk. Aidan MacDonald sat behind the desk. He had discarded his jacket. He wore a crisp white shirt, a charcoal vest, and a dark tie loosened exactly half an inch at his throat. He was reading a thick ledger, a fountain pen moving methodically across the page. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't acknowledge the heavy thud of the steel door closing behind her. Nora stood in the center of the room. The heat radiating off her own panic felt entirely out of place in this frigid, sterile environment. She waited for him to speak. She waited for a threat. He turned a page. The scratch of the pen continued. 5 minutes passed. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders. She shifted her weight, her boots scuffing against the concrete floor. Still, he ignored her. It was a power play. A brutal, simple assertion of dominance. He was demonstrating that her time, her anxiety, her very presence were entirely subject to his schedule. "Are you going to shoot me, or are you just going to bore me to death?" Nora snapped. The words ripped out of her before her brain could filter them. The sheer, terrifying audacity of her own mouth shocked her. The scratching of the pen stopped. Aidan slowly capped the fountain pen and set it down with geometric precision parallel to the edge of the ledger. He lifted his head. Those pale, empty gray eyes locked onto hers, dissecting her completely. "You are impatient," he observed, his gravelly voice echoing slightly in the bare room. "Impatient people make mistakes. They rush toward the fire because they cannot endure the heat of waiting. You kidnapped me from my job. I summoned you. There is a distinction," Aidan said, leaning back in his creaking metal chair. He steepled his fingers, watching her with that same unnerving clinical fascination. "You bought the coat. It is functional, a practical choice." "Why am I here?" she demanded, crossing her arms tightly over her chest to hide her trembling. "I told you, I purchased your time as a retainer. I wish to observe the anomaly." He gestured toward a solitary, hard-backed wooden chair positioned in the corner of the room. "Sit." "I don't want to sit. I want to know what you want from me." Aidan stood up. The sudden movement was fluid and fast, lacking any of the slow deliberation he usually projected. He rounded the desk, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. Nora backed up, her heel catching on an uneven ridge in the concrete. She stumbled, hitting the wall with her shoulder blades. The cold surface seeped immediately through her coat. Aidan didn't touch her, but he stopped mere inches away. He placed one hand on the wall beside her head, boxing her in. His physical presence was overwhelming. Up close, the silver scar on his jaw looked jagged, a violent interruption on otherwise starkly handsome features. "What I want," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating in her chest, "is to understand why you do not break. A normal citizen brought into this room would be weeping. They would be begging for their life, offering me whatever meager assets they possess. You are trembling violently. Your heart rate is elevated to a dangerous level, and yet you continue to insult me." He leaned in closer. She felt his breath against her cheek. The scent of peppermint and copper flooded her senses. "It is entirely contradictory," he whispered, his eyes tracking the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat. "I detest contradictions. I dismantle them until they make sense." "I'm not a math problem," Nora breathed, her voice shaking badly. She couldn't look away from his mouth. The memory of the bar, of pressing her lips to that cold, rigid line, flared in her mind with humiliating clarity. "Everything is a math problem, Nora," he replied softly. His gaze dropped to her mouth, lingering there for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her eyes. Every human action is an equation of leverage and desire. You operate on a completely different metric. I intend to figure out what it is. He pulled away, the sudden absence of his heat leaving her shivering. He walked back to his desk, picking up a thick stack of manila folders. Sit in the chair, he commanded, his tone reverting instantly to the flat-board enforcer. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not touch anything. Nora pushed herself off the wall. Her legs felt like water. The defiance had drained out of her, replaced by a deep, hollow realization. He wasn't going to hurt her physically. He was going to dismantle her psychologically. He was going to pull her into his orbit and force her to breathe his air until she forgot how to survive anywhere else. She walked over to the hard wooden chair and sat down. Aiden returned his attention to the ledger. He opened the first folder, picking up his pen. For the next 4 hours, Nora sat in silence. She watched him work. She watched a man who commanded killers meticulously cross-reference shipping manifests and offshore accounts. Occasionally, men would knock, enter the room, and speak in hushed, urgent tones. Men with bruised knuckles and holstered weapons. Aiden handled them with the same terrifying, quiet efficiency, issuing orders that clearly involved extortion, violence, and vast sums of money. He never asked them to hide their words from her. He was exposing her to the sheer, unfiltered reality of what he was. He was showing her the monster, daring her to look away. But as the hours ticked by, the harsh neon lights buzzing overhead, Nora realized the most dangerous truth of all. She wasn't looking away. She was leaning in. And the monster knew exactly what he was doing. Winter sank its teeth into the city, freezing the harbor into a landscape of brittle gray ice and rusted iron. 6 weeks had passed since Nora first stepped into the concrete office. 6 weeks of a twisted, suffocating routine that defied all logic. She still worked her shifts at the diner, but the grease and the burnt coffee felt like an illusion. The reality was the black sedan waiting at the curb every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 11 p.m. She was no longer a captive in the traditional sense. She was a designated variable. Aiden took her to warehouses that smelled of damp cardboard and diesel. He took her to backroom poker games choked with cigar smoke and men who spoke in low, dangerous murmurs. He forced her to sit in the corner, always observing, while he executed the brutal clockwork mechanics of his syndicate. He was desensitizing her. She knew it. He was slowly submerging her in boiling water, letting her acclimate so she wouldn't realize her old life was already dead. Tonight, the sedan was parked near the edge of Pier 44. The engine idled, a low, constant thrum vibrating through the plush leather seats. Outside the tinted glass, sleet lashed down in diagonal sheets, pinging sharply against the roof. Nora sat in the back, the heavy charcoal coat swallowed by the shadows. The heater blasted dry, suffocating air over her freezing boots. Aiden had stepped out 20 minutes ago. Thomas was not in the driver's seat. Another man, a silent, broad-shouldered substitute named Griggs, sat behind the wheel. The tension in the front seat was palpable. Griggs kept tapping his thumb against the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the rear-view mirror every few seconds. Nora stared out at the blurry, halogen-lit shipping containers. The sleet distorted the world outside, turning it into a smear of yellow and black. She was terrified, but it was a new breed of terror. It wasn't the blind panic of the dive bar. It was a dense, heavy dread, rooted in the agonizing friction of waiting. She hated Aidan MacDonald. She hated his control, his coldness, his arrogant assumption that he could dissect her like a lab rat. Yet, beneath the hatred, a terrifying addiction had taken root. The sheer electric voltage of being near him made the rest of her existence feel like a black and white movie played on mute. A sharp, flat crack echoed over the wail of the wind. Griggs stiffened instantly. His hand vanished beneath his coat. Nora stopped breathing. It didn't sound like a movie gunshot. It wasn't booming or dramatic. It was a sharp, pathetic pop, like a heavy textbook dropped flat onto a concrete floor. But the sudden, absolute stillness in the front seat confirmed her worst fear. 2 more pops followed in rapid succession. "Stay down!" Griggs barked, his voice tight. He threw the car into drive, the tires spinning uselessly against the icy asphalt for a sickening second before catching. Nora threw herself sideways, her cheek hitting the cold leather bench. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. The smell of the leather interior suddenly made her deeply nauseous. She squeezed her eyes shut, listening to the roar of the wind and the screech of tires as Griggs whipped the heavy sedan around a stack of wooden pallets. The car slammed to a halt, throwing Nora hard against the back of the front seat. The passenger door was wrenched open. A blast of freezing air and sleet invaded the warm cabin, followed immediately by a heavy, dark mass collapsing onto the seat. "Drive!" a voice rasped. It was Aidan. Griggs slammed his foot on the gas. The sedan surged forward, fishtailing wildly, before shooting out of the pier gates and onto the desolate industrial access road. Nora slowly pushed herself upright. The cabin lights were off, the darkness nearly absolute. But the sharp, overwhelming scent hitting her nostrils required no illumination. It was copper, hot, fresh, and metallic. Aidan was slumped against the passenger door. He was breathing heavily, a ragged, uneven sound that shattered his usual terrifying composure. "Turn on the overhead," Nora demanded, her voice shaking violently. "Leave it off," Aidan snapped. The command lacked its usual bite. He sounded strained. Nora ignored him. She lunged forward, her fingers scrambling over the plush ceiling until she found the plastic switch. The amber dome light clicked on, flooding the cabin. Aidan's heavy black overcoat hid the damage well, but his left hand was pressed tightly against his lower rib cage. Dark, viscous fluid seeped steadily between his fingers, dripping onto the pristine leather seat. His face was pale, the silver scar on his jaw standing out in stark relief against his ashen skin. He looked at her. For the very first time, the vast, empty gray of his eyes contained a flicker of actual pain. Nora didn't think. The paralyzing fear that usually glued her to the seat evaporated, replaced by a surge of raw, jagged adrenaline. She scrambled over the center console, ignoring Griggs's shouted warning, and dropped into the tight space between the front and back seats, kneeling beside Aidan. "Move your hand," she ordered. "Nora, sit back down." His voice was a warning, low and dangerous, but his breath hitched at the end of the sentence. "Move it, or I'll break your fingers," she snarled, the ferocity in her own voice shocking her. Aidan stared at her, his jaw clenching. Slowly, painfully, he pulled his hand away. The fabric of his vest was torn and soaked black. Nora didn't know anything about gunshot wounds. She only knew that blood belonged on the inside. She unbuttoned her heavy charcoal coat with trembling hands, shrugging it off her shoulders. She grabbed the hem of her cheap, faded flannel shirt and ripped it upward with all her strength. The buttons popped, scattering across the floorboards like plastic teeth. She balled the torn flannel into a thick pad and pressed it violently against the wound. Aiden flinched, a harsh hiss escaping his teeth. His head snapped back against the headrest, the muscles in his neck cording with agony. "Keep the pressure," Griggs grunted from the driver's seat, accelerating hard around a sharp curve. Nora leaned her entire body weight onto her hands. Her knuckles were white, her forearms trembling under the strain. The blood soaked through the flannel instantly, hot and sticky against her palms. "You're ruining your shirt," Aiden murmured. His eyes were half closed, fixed on her face. The gravel in his voice was softer now, almost conversational, a bizarre contrast to the chaos of the speeding car and the blood on her hands. "Shut up," she cried, a tear of pure, frustrated terror finally breaking loose and tracing a hot path down her freezing cheek. "Just shut up and bleed quietly." A ghost of a smile, a real, genuine shift of his mouth, pulled at his lips. He reached up with his uninjured, blood-slicked hand. His fingers brushed her cheek, wiping away the tear with a clumsy, heavy touch. Predictable," he whispered, his thumb tracing her jawline, smearing a streak of his own blood across her pale skin. "You are entirely uncalculated." The friction of his rough thumb against her skin sent a violent shockwave straight to her core. In the harsh amber light of the fleeing car, surrounded by the scent of ozone and violent death, Nora realized she wasn't pushing him away. She was leaning into his touch. The monster was bleeding, and she was the one trying to keep him whole. The safe house was a sterile, high-rise penthouse that smelled of ozone and expensive floor wax. It felt less like a home and more like a surgical theater. A man carrying a black leather bag had arrived 10 minutes after they did. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look at Nora. He simply gestured for Aiden to lie back on the massive white leather sofa in the living room, cut away the ruined vest, and went to work. Nora stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled below them, a grid of yellow streetlights and creeping shadows. The sleet had turned to snow, drifting lazily against the reinforced glass. Her hands were stained deep, rusty brown. The blood had dried into the cracks of her knuckles and beneath her fingernails. It felt like a permanent brand. She was shivering, wrapped tightly in her heavy coat over the remains of her torn shirt. Behind her, the doctor packed his bag. The metallic snap of the clasp echoed loudly in the vast room. The bullet passed clean through the oblique. He lost blood, but no vital organs were compromised, the doctor said, his tone perfectly flat. "Keep him still for 48 hours. Change the dressing twice a day. If he runs a fever, call me." He left without waiting for an acknowledgement. The heavy oak door clicked shut, plunging the penthouse into absolute silence. Nora didn't turn around immediately. She stared at her own reflection in the dark glass. She looked like a ghost. Her hair was a tangled mess, her eyes sunken and wide, a smear of dried blood cutting across her cheekbone like war paint. "Come here." The gravelly voice was weaker, but the command was absolute. Nora closed her eyes. She drew a slow, ragged breath, filling her lungs with the scent of rubbing alcohol and peppermint. She turned and walked toward the center of the room. Aiden was sitting up on the edge of the sofa. His torso was wrapped tightly in white gauze. The color was slowly returning to his face, but the exhaustion etched into his features was profound. He looked entirely human. It was the most terrifying thing she had seen all night. She stopped 3 feet away, crossing her arms tightly. "You should be lying down," she said, her voice sounding incredibly small in the cavernous room. "You saved my life," Aiden stated. He wasn't praising her. He was analyzing a new piece of data. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "I plugged a hole," Nora corrected bitterly. "Griggs drove the car. The doctor sewed you up. Don't make it a debt. I don't want anything from you." "That is a lie." The absolute certainty in his voice snapped the last frayed wire of her patience. "Do you ever stop?" Nora shouted, stepping forward, her hands dropping to her sides, fists clenched. The fear was gone, burned away by the raw, chaotic energy of the night. "Do you ever stop running everything through your twisted equations? I am not a math problem. I am not an anomaly. I am a person who is trapped in your sick, violent world because I needed $50 to pay a gas bill." Aiden didn't flinch. He watched her chest heave, watching the fury radiate off her in waves. "You could have stayed in the car," he said softly. "You could have let me bleed out in the back seat. The men would have dropped you back at your apartment. Your debt would be cleared. The variable would be removed." He stood up. The movement was slow, agonizingly deliberate, but he didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her. The heat of his body radiated against the cold wool of her coat. "Why didn't you let me die, Nora?" She stared up at him. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The truth was too heavy, too jagged to articulate. She couldn't tell him that the thought of his empty gray eyes going dark forever had paralyzed her more than the gunfire. "Because," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I'm stupid." Aiden reached out, both hands this time. He gripped her face, his calloused palms rough against her cheeks, his thumbs resting over her cheekbones. His touch possessed a desperate, bruising urgency that shattered his composed facade entirely. "You broke the algorithm," he breathed, his voice a harsh rasp, devoid of any calculated calm. "I brought you in to break you, to figure out why you didn't flinch. And instead, you have systematically dismantled every ounce of control I possess." He didn't wait for her to answer. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a dare. It wasn't a static, terrified collision in a dive bar. It was a violent, desperate surrender. His mouth was hot, tasting of copper, whiskey, and the bitter tang of adrenaline. Nora gasped against his lips, and he swallowed the sound, his hand sliding from her face to tangle in her hair, holding her in place as if she were the only solid object in a collapsing room. Nora's hands came up, pushing against his uninjured shoulder, a fleeting instinct to fight him off. But the resistance crumbled instantly. Her fingers curled into his shirt, anchoring herself to him. She kissed him back with all the raw, imperfect fury she had harbored for weeks. Their teeth clashed. It was messy, chaotic, and completely devoid of romance. It was two drowning people fighting for the same pocket of air. Aiden pulled back slightly, his chest heaving, his forehead resting against hers. They were both breathing harshly, the silence of the penthouse shattered by the sound of their ragged exhales. "There is no walking away now," he murmured against her mouth, his breath hot on her skin. It was a promise and a death sentence. "You belong to the chaos." Nora opened her eyes. The gray emptiness in his gaze was completely gone, replaced by a dark, consuming fire. She felt the dried blood cracking on her hands where they gripped his shirt. She knew exactly what he was. A killer, a ghost, a man who calculated ruin. She tightened her grip on his shirt. "I know," she whispered. She pulled him back down, completely ignoring the edge of the knife she had just willingly pressed against her own throat. That's the end of Nora and Aiden's descent into the beautiful, chaotic dark. If this gritty, high-stakes collision kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button to let the algorithm know you want more. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow dark romance lovers and hit subscribe so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment below. Did Nora make the right choice, or did she just seal her own fate? Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.